Have you ever wondered how your body works? More importantly, if you don't know how your body works, how could you ever hope to fix it? Today, we're going to give some basic information how your body actually works, you can actually understand and actually use to start making actual decisions in your actual life. I know that's a lot of actual. My name's Chris. I'm a pharmacist. I'm also a biochemist and a supplement expert. And today, we're going to take some educational material to help you understand how your body works. So then when we start talking about supplements and the roles they play, you can have some context. So again, your body is very complex and it's also very simple. And it often is both things at the same time. And just to give some background, unfortunately, sometimes when we start to explain something, we have to explain something else to help you understand that. So today we're going to try to keep it as focused as possible. The fundamental unit of your body is a cell, which is a sphere typically. And inside of it is fluids, which have proteins and usually fat bilayer membranes, which form secondary pockets, okay? The components inside the cells are typically called organelles, and organelles typically do only a few things. They either store information, they convert information into a manufacturable form, or they actually convert the information into making something. So typically we talk about the central dogma of life, which is DNA becomes mRNA, which then becomes proteins. And then those proteins go out into the cell, and the proteins are the workhorse, or the ones that do all the functions. So that's why we're always talking about proteins, because no matter what role we're talking about or where we are in the biology or in the cell, it's typically the protein that's doing most of the heavy lifting. Okay. Proteins are basically a series of amino acids, which is another word for protein. And based off the sequence of those amino acids, they actually form into a structure. So they have positive charges and negative charges, and those charges basically organize and form a structure, and that structure gives the function of the protein. So if you change the sequence, you change the structure, which means you change the function. Okay. So over time, the function has an effect on the structure changes, which inhibits the function. And that's where heat shock proteins come in. Just to give you an example, is they come in and they basically reshape those proteins back to the way they were supposed to be, and then make them working again. If the heat shock protein finds that it's not going to be able to actually properly refold the protein, it degrades it and has a new one made, and there's a lot of advantages to that. A lot of anti-aging is thought to occur to heat shock proteins being able to degrade and replace those proteins. And an example of that could be intermittent fasting, where the body basically accelerates its turnover of older proteins with potential health benefits shown. Okay. So basically, to kind of put that all together, let's use an example now. So let's say it's really hot outside and your body is beginning to get too warm and the body doesn't want to get too warm. So how does it fix that? Well, the body may have sensors which say, okay, it's warm, I'm sweating, and it's above the threshold. Those signals are going to migrate through our nervous system using things like catecholamines and other hormones, cortisol, and basically begin to change genetic expression so that we can get a new set of proteins that are going to allow us to better cope with that. So in this case, the cortisol may go into the cell, it goes through the pores and the membrane of the outer cell, and floats into the inside, and it might actually go all the way to the nucleus and act as what's called a transcription factor. So transcription factor is actually when a protein modulates which part of the DNA is expressed. So again, in our example, we're hot, we're in the sun, we need to do something, cortisol goes into the cell, it binds to the DNA and changes which part of the DNA is transcribed or expressed, which is why it's called a transcription factor. So again, now we're going to shift the DNA, we're going to open it up because it's typically wound up in a ball. So we're going to open the ball, expose the part of the DNA we know that has the code or sequence that we're going to need to use, and an mRNA protein comes on and basically binds to the DNA and moves across it, and converts the DNA into RNA, or what's called mRNA. That's a copy of it. Because the DNA is so important, the DNA never leaves the nucleus of the cell, which is like an inner envelope. It's like the vault of the cell. DNA never leaves the nucleus under very few circumstances. Because if something happens to the DNA, it's catastrophic for the cell. So what it does is it makes a copy of the DNA, which is the mRNA. The mRNA floats out of the nucleus, it goes into the cytoplasm of the cell, and it typically migrates its way to what's called a ribosome. The ribosome is the actual machine. The mRNA binds to the ribosome of the machine, and as the ribosome goes through the mRNA, it translates it or transcribes it into proteins. So those proteins are basically made up of mRNA sequences. So typically every 3 mRNA sequences codes for a new amino acid. So what you have coming out of the ribosome is this series of amino acids that were transcribed from the mRNA. So again, you have DNA, which turns into mRNA, which binds to the ribosome, which then is turned into the protein. You have that sequence of amino acids, which is now a new protein, and then it basically goes and becomes folded into that new structure. And that protein can do a bunch of things at that point. That protein can go back into the nucleus and transcribe more. It can go into the cytoplasm and then begin to bind and regulate with other cell organelles or other cell machines to say, hey, do this now or don't do this now. Or it can actually be excreted out of the cell to go into the cytoplasmic fluid, the interstitial fluid, or make its way into the blood and actually diffuse throughout the body and go somewhere far on and do something else. So that's kind of a basic example of how your biology works on a cellular level, all the way from an external stimulus, which elicits typically a result of a hormone change or a neurotransmitter change, which then results in the activation of a transcription factor, which will then go into the cell, into the nucleus. It binds to the DNA, makes a copy of mRNA, which then leaves the nucleus, binds to a ribosome, which is then transcribed into amino acid sequences, which get folded into proteins, and the protein basically goes out either within the cell or outside the cell or into the bloodstream to elicit its effect. So I know that's kind of complicated, but I think you can also see how it's relatively straightforward. Basically have an external stimulus, which results in the genetic expression being changed, which results in a new protein being changed, which then is able to go out and elicit a new function. So in a lot of sense, that's kind of the basis of cell biology. And by understanding that part, everything else can start to make more sense. So for example, those proteins, when they fold, they need vitamins and minerals to fold properly. The best example is magnesium. You need magnesium to fold a protein. If you don't have enough magnesium, those proteins don't fold properly. To give you another example is zinc. So when that transcription factor goes into the cell, goes into the nucleus, goes into the bind to the DNA to transcribe, it uses oftentimes what's called a zinc finger. The zinc actually allows the transcription factor to bind to the DNA in the proper spot and the proper orientation with the proper tightness. Well, you could imagine if you don't have zinc in your body, what's going to happen with the transcription factors. So that's another example where something like zinc could be important. Another example is anytime we make something, we use energy. So all of those steps with transcription, translation, mRNA, ribosomes, all that, they all require ATP. Basically, something binds to something, ATP comes in, it cuts off a phosphorus bond, and that bond releases the energy, and then it converts from ATP to ADP. The ADP goes off and gets recycled. In that process, when the energy transfers over, that's where the new bond's created. So that's how we're adding or subtracting molecules or atoms in these structures. We have what's called free radicals that get created. There's extra electrons that weren't properly donated to the end goal, and those electrons are basically stranded, and now they're kind of wandering around saying, where do I go, where do I go, where do I go? Eventually they bind to something. Unfortunately, when you put a free electron, or a free radical in this case, in the wrong spot, it causes damage because you're basically putting too much, or you might be creating a bond you didn't mean to create or breaking a bond you needed. So my point is that all these cellular machinery, they're essential for life, as we've talked about, but there's consequences of that. And in this case, we're talking about free radicals. So that can be where something like an antioxidant can come in. In this case, we'll talk about vitamin C. Vitamin C is basically able to bind that electron, that free radical, and sequester it or remove it from the system. So instead of that free electron running around and doing damage, it gets absorbed by vitamin C, it gets removed, it can't create any damage. So that would be another example of how a mineral or a vitamin could potentially help the body. So we just want to give some basic background because we truly feel that if patients understand how their body works, when we explain the supplements and educate them on the supplements, it'll make more sense. So this is one of our videos in our educational series. This would be one of the more fundamental videos. This is going to help you understand how the cell works and how the cell responds to external stimuli and why we need things like magnesium, zinc, and vitamin C to help that work properly. Just to give you another example with the free radical, one of the most catastrophic consequences it can cause is if it donates that electron to the DNA chain, it can actually sever the DNA chain and cause a break. or it can change the DNA structure in a way that changes the way it works. Again, DNA is the most core fundamental component of a cell. That's where all the information is stored. The cell goes to great length to keep that protected. And in this case, that free electron can damage it in a very catastrophic way. There's lots of diseases that are thought to potentially occur due to DNA damage. That's a term you'll see common in the literature. And so again, vitamin C has multiple roles of what it can do for your body. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in learning more about, click the subscribe button and follow our series of education here. Again, our goal is to help you better understand your body so you can make better decisions or actual decisions based on actual information. My name is Chris. I am a biochemist and a registered pharmacist with a doctorate of pharmacology. I have over 15 years of biochemistry, pharmacy, and wellness experience. And I think that my goal is to take all that information and synthesize it in a way that you can understand it. So again, you can make better decisions. Thank you and have a great day.